Hello, it's Justin Woodall with Iron Horse Property Management. Today I want to talk to you about whether it's better to have a longer term lease on your property or to rent for a shorter term. I'm going to give you the pros and cons of each. So what's best for you, a long-term lease or a short-term lease? So a couple of benefits to a long-term lease, and if you've heard any of my videos or ever talked to me before, you understand I'm big on getting a tenant in, keeping them there for a long time. That's how you really become profitable in owning rental property, but because it's expensive anytime somebody moves out and moves back in. So generally speaking, I'm a big fan of longer term leases. I'm a big fan of getting a tenant in and staying for a long time. The cons to that are sometimes, and I'm going to use an extreme example. Say you find a tenant, and typically we do 1-year leases or 2-year leases, but I'm going to give you an extreme example. And say you find a tenant that wants to sign a 5-year lease, and you think, great, they're going to be here for 5 years. The only negative to that, the downside of that is if we move them in today, what's going to be the market rent in 5 years? And if it's a few $100s higher, then you may have cost yourself by doing that, by moving that tenant in. They've got the benefit of having the same rent all the way through for 5 years, whereas if we were reevaluating that each year, you might be making $200 or $300 more per month, but if the rent's raised that much. And maybe they do, maybe they don't. But that's just something to consider if you're thinking about an extremely long-term lease. Again, we feel like it's best to do 1 or 2 years. And if you wanted to do something longer, we could, and we could even build in, or you could even build in some rent increases at each anniversary date. So that's one way you can handle that. On the flip side, we're seeing more and more people doing short-term leases. And as I evaluate and look at that, also can be very profitable if you do it the right way. And so what are the pros of having a short-term lease? Obviously the con would be that you're constantly having turnover, people moving in and out, you're constantly having vacancy, and you're having to touch up this, clean that, whatever that case may be. And it's just a lot more oversight, a lot more to maintain. So that would be the negative to the shorter term, but what's the positive? Well, the positive is that you can charge a lot more. And so if you're able to charge a lot more on a monthly basis, then that may offset some of that time that there's vacancy or offset some of that turnover time. So again, there's no right answer. It's something you have to evaluate for yourself. But to give you an extreme example on the short-term rental side, just look at Airbnb. Now, obviously those places are leased, but somebody may come in on something that might rent for, $1,500 a month. You may be able to charge $200 a night if it's an Airbnb, but you've got some expensive furnishing it, you've got some expensive utilities. But if you do $200 a night and you keep it full for a month, that's $6,000 in a month instead of $1,500 in a month. Now, obviously, it's not likely to stay occupied that whole time. There's going to be some vacancy. But again, if you say, well, it was rented half the time, well, then you're bringing in $3,000 instead of $1,500 with some additional expenses that you wouldn't have on the long-term lease. So again, there's no right answer for everybody. There's pros and cons to both, but those are some things for you to think about if you're trying to consider short-term versus long-term on rental. Again, personally, I like the long-term. Get them in, set it and forget it. Let that money pour in each month with as little maintenance as possible. But again, that's not right for everyone.